Hey, welcome to everybody to the fourth lecture of our webinar series on Sephardic thought and modernity. We were very hesitant about whether we should still meet today as planned. The current events in Israel, Palestine, and the violence, fear, and hate that we have been witnessing from close and afar left us in a state of mourning, confused, troubled, and wondering if meeting today made any sense at all. We decided to hold on to hope and continue trying to build a multi-faced argument about Judaism, social justice, democracy, inclusion, and reception of otherness. This hope keeps us going. Our hearts go to everyone suffering right now, and our solidarity is with everyone trying what seems impossible. That is to uphold several truths at the same time, to renounce violence, and to recover a radical commitment to a shared and better future in the region. In a way, this seminar has been a very modest attempt to put together different visions and hopes, different historical references that helped us imagine a better future. Today, this feels more necessary than ever. We started our series by remembering the fertile and prosperous Arab Jewish historical experience. Al-Muqbihar reminded us all that within that experience, there were critically important clues to think about the present and future of Israel-Palestine. Yaakov Yadgar brought to our discussion table the experience of tradition as nourished by both change and loyalty, a Jewish tradition rooted in Muslim and Arab lands and culture, a tradition that refuses to be defined and categorized along dichotomic lines that alienate people and relations among them. Clemens Buluk reconstructed Lydia Ben-Amozek's religious imagination, in which things that seem to be at odds can in fact be reconciled, and coexistence with otherness should not be feared. She spoke about Ben-Amozek's conception of the Orient as a mental space that establishes continuity and harmony between heaven and earth, religion and science, individuals and society, reflective discourse and action as an alternative to inertia. Today, we hold on to this alternative to inertia and gather strength to continue exploring other attempts at reframing Jewish tradition and thought in order to keep them alive, relevant, and helpful. This time, Gabriela Ben-Sur is joining the conversation and will speak to us about Rabbi Yosef Knafo and his struggle for democratization of knowledge by the end of the 19th century in Essaouira, Morocco. So now Yuval Ivri will introduce Gabriel, and the seminar will start.
Thank you, Angie. It's a great pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Gabriel. Gabriel Ben-Sur is a PhD student in the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His dissertation examines the history from below of Algerian Jews during the colonial period. His research lies at the intersection of post-colonialism studies, Jewish law, and history. Gabriel also holds an MA in Jewish history from the Hebrew University and wrote a thesis titled Parallel Spaces, Jewish Elites at the End of the 19th Century, Mogador, Morocco. He's also a fellow in the Israeli Rabbis program in the Shalom Hartman Institute. He teaches Talmud, Halacha, and rabbinical Sephardic literature in different places and regularly writes for the French Jewish journal, Tenua. So Gabriel, you have 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it for discussion, and people can ask questions or write in the chat. So Gabriel, with great pleasure.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Despite the complicated situation, it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I've learned so much from the other lecturers of this webinar that I really feel that for me, it's a great honor to participate too. And thanks to Dr. Angie Cohen and Dr. Yuval Ivri for the organization of this webinar. So tonight I want to discuss the work of Rabbi Yosef Knafo on this struggle for democratization of knowledge at the end of the 19th century Essaouira. But before, I want to begin with two introductions, one concerning the historical context and the other the theoretical framing of this lecture. So I will begin with a short historical introduction, mainly based on Daniel Shorter's work, who wrote extensively about the Jewish community of Essaouira. So Knafo was born in 1823 in the town of Mogador, Essaouira, Morocco. In the latter half of the 19th century, Essaouira was subject to many social changes. European Jewish philanthropic organizations such as l'Alliance Israélite Universelle and the Anglo-Jewish Association established in Essaouira created modern Jewish schools and actively promoted westernization. And in the meantime, waves of internal Jewish immigration, along with the decline of Essaouira as the main seaport of Morocco, negatively impacted the socio-economic situation. And frequent tensions arose between the Jews of the Mlach, the Jewish quarter, and the wealthy privileged Jews residing in the Kasbah. And from the 80s, some native-born Jews began speaking out against poverty. And activists from the Mlach, along with some members of the new elite of European protégés, openly began to struggle for social reform. And by the turn of the decade, the pro-reform Jews were expressing openly their criticism of the establishment, and especially of Reuven El-Maliach, the president of the community. And over the next few years, several petitions were presented to the Moroccan authorities pushing for social reform within the community. So this is very briefly the social context of the Jewish community of Essaouira at this time. And as a modest native-born Jew privy to no external protection, Knafo could hardly afford to openly protest the established ruling group. But through his books, we will see that Knafo provided a religious ideological backing to the struggle, reaching both for and from the lower classes. Knafo encouraged the people to study and to educate themselves. He blamed the rabbis for abandoning them and called for democratization of religious knowledge. But before exploring Knafo's work, I want to add some words on the theoretical framing of this lecture. Scholars of Jewish history have long regarded the terms tradition and modernity as antinomic. And following a Weberian paradigm, Jewish historians have portrayed traditional Jewish society as mainly static, determined by obedience to the sacred authority of tradition. And as the perfect antithesis of tradition, modernity signified a breaking with the past, inter alia through the processes of rationalization and secularization. And per this view, modernization was synonymous with westernization, and ipso facto, it started in the non-European context as a result of the rise of the European colonial enterprise. And in the last lectures of this webinar, we all heard scholars who challenge this view, highlighting new perspectives on social and intellectual life in Sephardic societies. And in the same way, my purpose is to show another facet of the multiple modernities of the pre-colonial North African Jewish communities. And scholars like Joseph Chetri, Daniel Shorter, Jessica Marglin, and Clemence Boulouk, and others already proposed a re-examination of Jewish modernities in North Africa in many different ways. And in their footsteps, I want to propose a re-examination based on rabbinic literature. And this re-examination is particularly important when speaking about rabbis and rabbinic literature. Although there is already some important works concerning North African rabbinic literature during the pre-colonial period, as for example, the work of Zvi Zohar, the focus remains on the elites, and mainly on poskim, the legal scholars, and sometimes on prominent Kabbalists. But there are a lot of minor figures, communal rabbis, preachers, and educators who wrote and published during this period. And I think that their works are exactly what Foucault called subjugated knowledge, meaning historical contents that have been buried and masked, as well as knowledge outside of the field that have been disqualified as naive or minor. So for me, the purpose of this lecture is to discuss Knafo work as one example of many other figures and works that require further analysis in order to re-examine our historical understanding of this period. And I think that we can present Knafo as a traditional figure advocating for modernity. And Knafo was traditional in the sense that he saw himself as part of an ancestral and also authoritative tradition. He had no wish to either abolish or reform. Nevertheless, Knafo can be understood as a proponent of modernity, as he sought to redefine the religious relationship between the scholarly elite and common people as part of a global social protest against the Jewish establishment in Essaouira. With this in mind, we can focus now on Knafo's work. So the precise number of Knafo books is not known, but it is clear that Knafo wrote extensively. We have 12 published and unpublished works that have been handed down, some intended for scholars and others for lay people. And it is interesting to note that his scholarly works preceded the others, but Knafo did not attempt to publish the scholarly works. Rather, the 6 books that he succeeded in publishing during his lifetime were all aimed at a popular audience. And I want to open with one term that appears a lot in Knafo's books. And the evolution of this term throughout his work, which shows the evolution of Knafo himself. So this term is hamon in Hebrew. And this is a tricky term because in rabbinical writings, it generally refers pejoratively to the ignorance, hamonim, but during the second half of the 19th century, many Maskilim and Hebrew writers also used it in a social or political sense to signify the masses or multitude. And Knafo obviously knew some of the texts, as I will discuss later. So the genealogy of this term in Knafo's books shows a changing use of the term. He always uses it to speak about the masses or about the lower Jewish class. And in the beginning, in a pejorative way, as so many rabbis before him, but there is a novelty from the beginning, and this is that Knafo writes for them. But through the books, the genealogy of this term demonstrated a growing identification with the lower Jewish classes, and ultimately culminating in an open confrontation with the rabbinical establishment, whom Knafo considered to be exclusive and disconnected from the people. And here we can find a subversion of this term from the pejorative view of the masses as ignorant to a new perception of the masses as all those who have been pushed to the margins, but have a huge spiritual potential. For example, in one occurrence, paraphrasing Jewish liturgy, Knafo uses the expression hamone mala in Hebrew to refer to the Jewish masses. Also, the expression traditionally refers to the angels. So Hamon is totally subverted in a positive thing. And I want to illustrate this claim with one of Knafo's commentaries among many. Knafo's rabbinic writing can be a little bit disconcerting for those who are not used to it. But I think it is important to understand how Knafo succeeded to produce novelty using very traditional language and without breaking from the tradition. So the quote is from his book, Hot Brit Kodesh, published in 1884. And the context is several homilies and commentaries on sexuality and holiness. And the text is a commentary on the verse from Song of Songs, chapter 8. And I quote, Solomon had a vineyard in Baal Hamon. He let out his vineyard to tenants. Each was to bring for its fruit 1,000 pieces of silver. End of quote, end of the verse. As Midrashic commentaries, Knafo offers a metaphorical reading of this verse based on a new and non-literal interpretation of each word. So the word vineyard signifies the entire Torah, as often in the Midrash. The name Solomon refers to God, again, according to a classical Midrash that understands Shlomo as Melech Shalom Shelo, as the one to whom peace belongs. At this point, we have the metaphorical reading of the first part of the verse. In the beginning, Solomon had a vineyard, meaning that in the beginning, the Torah belongs to God. But the verse continues. He let out his vineyard to tenants. And this is where it gets interesting. The literal meaning of Baal Hamon is a place. But Baal Hamon also means the master of the mazes. And Knafo quotes a Kabbalist text to claim that Baal Hamon is Moses, whose soul encompasses all the souls of all the multitude of the house of Israel. And Moses is no longer an individual, but the expression of the whole collectivity. And through Moses, everyone was able to directly receive the Torah. And now, Knafo can read the end of the verse. Each was to bring for its fruit 1,000 pieces of silver. So Knafo said, if everyone had received the Torah, so the Torah of everyone has the same importance. And everyone can have direct access to it. Everyone has his part in the Torah, and there is no hierarchy, because the Torah is full, complete, only if all the Hamon, all the masses, take part in it. So I know that this text may sound very esoteric, but actually Knafo says something very simple, in his own words, within his own conceptual world, that the Torah, as the basis of the Jewish world, has to be accessible for everyone, that mass religious education is a necessity, and that hierarchy between scholars and simple people must disappear. And this text shows, I think, perfectly both the form and content of Knafo's work. At a structural level, this text is presented as a midrashic commentaries on a biblical verse, but not such a midrash exists. Rather, though it does not cite its sources, we can clearly see that his commentary is constructed from several Kabbalist and midrashic commentaries, selected by him, and then assembled into a new midrashic unit. And the utilization of authoritative external sources that are carefully cited as such, juxtaposed with an insistence that he had nothing original to say, were all part of Knafo's discursive strategy to legitimize his own subversive ideas. Saying that, I want to discuss now Knafo's criticism of the rabbinical establishment of his time. And this is another aspect of Knafo's distancing from the traditional rabbinic discourse. And we can find it in the paratext of his books, or more specifically in their absence. In 19th century Maghreb, Askamot, the traditional rabbinic endorsements, functioned as a tool for creating a written identity for the author and locating him inside the rabbinical world. The publication of books without Askamot was an anomaly in the Essaouira rabbinical world of the time. And surprisingly or not, the young Knafo asked for Askamot, and for his first books that remained unpublished, called Ma'at Sori, he received several Askamot from prominent local rabbis. But Knafo intentionally chose not to publish this book. So the lack of Askamot in Knafo's books was not random or accidental, but a deliberate act of independence from the authority of the rabbinical establishment. In 1888, Knafo published his third work called Chesed Hashem. And contrary to the book itself, which as usual was aimed at common people, the introduction was a tentative attempt by Knafo to defend himself from the rabbinical criticism he received for his two previous books, especially concerning the absence of Askamot, arguing that his books were too simple and therefore did not require any endorsements. And obviously, Knafo was aware that the main purpose of Askamot was not to testify to the important contributions of the author to the intellectual Jewish world, but rather a way to situate himself in relation to other rabbis, to express his respect and recognition of their authority, and to be part of the rabbinical milieu. But he had no interest in that. And Knafo's tacit controversy with the rabbinical establishment and his disengagement from their world become more acute in his fifth published work called Shomer Shabbat, published in 1882. It seems that by this point, the critical voices raised against the Jewish establishment in Essaouira were robust enough to allow a greater degree of free speech. In his introduction, Knafo explicitly mentions the harsh criticism he received from his colleagues for its choice to write for the masses. And this time, he does not try to mitigate his own criticism of the rabbinical establishment, but he quotes from the Mishnah Avot, agreeing with Bertinoro's traditional commentary that, and I quote, one who extends his reputation by means of power and authority, will quickly lose it, for authority buries those who wield it. In other words, Knafo revealed his lack of esteem for rabbis who grasp after authority. Not only is Knafo uninterested in receiving their approbations for his book, but he holds the scholarship in contempt and, likewise, the attitude toward the masses. And in one of his final books, Tov Roi, a commentary on Mishnah Avot, published in 1899, Knafo pulled out all the stops in his intellectual and social critique of the contemporary rabbinical establishment. And in his commentary to the words of the Mishnah Avot, I quote, "Go forth and observe which is the right way to which a human should cleave." So on these words, Knafo writes, I quote, "In my humble opinion, it seems that the Mishnah intentionally used the expression "go forth and observes" because the sages devote themselves to the intellectual part of the Torah, esoterics, exegesis, and homilies, but look not upon other subjects to observe and to know the right way and the wrong. Hence, Rabbi Yochanan adjured them, go forth temporarily from your study of Torah in order to help rectify the human condition, including the majority of the Jewish masses. And this is why it is written, go forth and observe which is the right way to which a human should live, intentionally using the term human, because it designates the majority of the Jewish masses, and you, the sages, must observe what is a good path to which they may cleave, such that through it the common good shall be enlarged. End of quote. So Knafo's denotation of the sages as disconnected from the real world is in marked contrast to Knafo himself, who goes forth and has interest for popular wisdom. He argues that more than the simple folk need the rabbis need them. And in order to better understand their society and to differentiate between good and bad, and it is likely that here Knafo had in mind the many social grievances being heard in his tone, and the inherent conservatism of the religious leaders who supported the traditional leadership in spite of its many flaws. So rabbis need to go forth, if it's, to encounter the reality as it is outside their ivory tower of Torah study in order to foster the common good. After these words concerning Knafo's critics of the rabbinical establishment, I want to speak about Knafo's sponsors and the alternative network of advocates of modernity that he built through his books. As I mentioned above, Knafo was a poor man who never took on an official rabbinic position. Lacking the support of local rabbis, it was only by demonstrating his creative abilities that he was able to offset the high cost of printing. And Knafo rose to the challenge of printing cost by promoting what was probably the first instance of Jewish crowdfunding in Morocco. So in his books include extensive lists of sponsors, the high number of people in each list proving that most of them were small donors. The majority of these sponsors are unknown individuals, presumably simple people who did nothing to make themselves stand out in any way. But however, I was able to pinpoint a significant minority of these names in other historical documents, and through them to outline the pro-Knafo network and to better understand its position within the Jewish Moroccan society of his time. So, for example, we can find in the list the names of some prominent local maskilim, enlightened Jews. On 3 occasions, Knafo thanks Yitzhak ben Yaish Halevi and presents him as the one who encouraged him to publish his books. Halevi was the owner of a local bookshop. And one of the first maskilim in Morocco, often writing for Haskalah newspapers from Eastern Europe, such as Essaouira, Amagil, and Amelitz. And despite some differences between the both, Halevi in his writings often criticized the educational deficiencies of the common people, and therefore, in all probability, supported the mass education that Knafo promoted. And another famous local maskil mentioned in the list is the Sheikh David Iflach, who published an anthology of Jewish Moroccan poetry with Halevi. Halevi and Iflach were known not only for their intellectual activities, but also for their involvement in favor of democratization and transparency within the leadership of the Jewish community. Driven by Moshe Lugassi, a local merchant who was in Great Britain for some time, a group of natives from the Mlach established a local branch of the Anglo-Jewish Association, working to improve the social, economic, and juridical situation of non-elite Jews. The 5 leaders of the Mlach branch, Moshe Lugassi, Yitzhak Halevi, David Iflach, Aaron Borbot, and Hanina Aben Chaim, all promoted reform in favor of the lower class within the community. And apart from Lugassi, all figure too as benefactors in Knafo's list. And this reinforces the evidence of Knafo's involvement in the local struggle. And it should be noted that some of them were also active members of the first Moroccan Zionist organization, founded in Essaouira in 1900, as well 2 more of Knafo listed benefactors, Yehuda Sabag and Nissim Afriat. And last but not least, Knafo had a first degree, relative active in both the circle of Maskilim and the Zionist organization. His own son, Rabbi David Knafo, future chief rabbi of the town. Another famous benefactor was Shimon Knawi, who presided over the Jewish community of Oran in Algeria between the years 1876 and 1916. Knawi was the sole known benefactor of Knafos who did not live in Essaouira, and he was a complex and ambivalent person, well loved among the native Jews of Oran, but described as a populist and opportunist from the point of view of the Jewish Francophile elite of his city. But what cannot be disputed is that Knawi was a prominent native leader of the Jewish community who desired the progressive integration of the Algerian Jews into French modernity, but in a non-disrupting way. And in this way, both Knafo and Knawi were part of the same vision that included democratization, education of the masses, and moderate modernization, but with us breaking the traditional paradigm. A significant milestone in the social movement occurred in 1889, when various well-to-do Jewish merchants, along with subjects of European countries, united in sharp opposition to the president of the community, Reuven El-Maliach. And among the 10 notables who signed the letter against El-Maliach, 3 of them were known to explicitly support Knafo, the 2 brothers Afriat, along with Yamin Ochana, and probably a 3rd, Victor Lombroso. And once again, we can note the intersection between the pro-reform camp, who struggled for a modernization of the community institutions, and between those who supported Knafo in his struggle for the democratization of Torah knowledge. And another important sponsor, maybe the man, was Eliyahu Ben Amozeg, who was both his sponsor and his printer. And Clemence Boulouk gave us a wonderful lecture on him during our last meeting, so I suppose there is no need to present Ben Amozeg again. I said previously that Knafo did not seek for rabbinical endorsements, but the first pages of his books often include laudatory introductions from Ben Amozeg. And this is an unusual thing in books published by Ben Amozeg. On 2 occasions, we find Knafo warmly praising Ben Amozeg for his personal help and generosity with regard to the printing of the books. So I think that for both Ben Amozeg and Knafo, these introductions were a discursive way to enhance their own respective agendas on legitimacy. Knafo needed Ben Amozeg more than the latter needed him, since the prestige of Ben Amozeg's printing press among Maghrebi rabbis provided an alternative source of authority for him after he shunned their askamot. And for his part, Ben Amozeg may have identified himself with both Knafo's socio-pedagogical goals and with the rabbinical criticism that he endured. But so Ben Amozeg, these local masculine Zionist activists and social reformers represent an eclectic mix of people from different backgrounds and classes, all of whom were attached to Jewish tradition while adopting modern views on socio-economic issues. And their presence as Knafo's benefactors speaks volumes about his goals and the way he was perceived socially within local society. Knafo offered strong spiritual support to all those who struggled for transparency, democratization, and equality. And in a perfect mutuality, they gave him, in return, the financial means to continue his work. Now I want to speak about class consciousness and external influences on Knafo's work. Even taking into account the possibility that Knafo was aware of some of the European debates concerning democratization, mass education, and class struggle, he was unable to read them directly in French or other Latin languages, and he did not mention any modern organizations, names, or books in his work. While no study to date has shown any evidence of the penetration of socialist ideas into Morocco before the French protectorate, either within the Muslim or the Jewish population. And the social context on the books Knafo usually quoted allow us to partially retrace his intellectual path and the emergence of his social consciousness. So Knafo brought explicit inspiration from several Jewish corpora, all seeking to disseminate knowledge and give access to learning and spirituality to the most underprivileged classes. Of particular note in this regard are Hasidic tales and Ottoman Musar literature, two literary genres that were largely unknown in 19th century Morocco. And despite their geographical distance, these two sources share the goal of democratizing Jewish knowledge, and in particular ideas inspired from the Kabbalah, and making it available to all Jewish classes. This vision rests on the belief that the final redemption will only come if and when all engage in Torah study. And following the harsh rabbinic criticism he received from his local colleagues, we may suppose that Knafo looked elsewhere for support and found it in these works, which until this moment were entirely unknown to the Jews of his region. Concerning Hasidic literature, in 1888, Knafo published the booklet Chesed Hashem, and the booklet included some tales of the Baal Shem Tov from the book Kal Hasidim, which Knafo adapted and translated into Judeo-Arabic. And this is the first instance of a Moroccan rabbi referring to the Hasidic world, and one of the first modern translations in Morocco of a text into Judeo-Arabic. Knafo did not explain how he obtained the book, but we can reasonably presume that Yitzhak Halevi, who was the local bookseller, and in direct communication with Eastern European Jews, was the first person in Essaouira to receive Hasidic books, and that he shared them with his friend Yosef Knafo. When we look on Knafo's translation, we can see the same pattern. The source tales generally focus on the Baal Shem Tov or other spiritual leaders who performed miracles and brought salvation to their communities. But at the close of each tale, Knafo generally draws out the moral, sometimes adding short sentences linked to the content. Thus, contrary to the Hasidic source, Knafo highlights ethical rather than hagiographic elements. The figure of the religious leader that emerged from the tales fits the new social order Knafo invoked, with the scholar dissociated from the masses being replaced by the righteous man closely tied to the simple people and acting on their behalf. And above all, the tales serve Knafo as a way of strengthening his vision of religiosity for the multitude, and of stressing that scholarly Torah study is not the only way to worship God. For other social practices, as prayer and charity, are just as valid. The only Hasidic book that Knafo explicitly quoted was Kal Hasidim, but it could be assumed that Knafo also knew the work of Rabbi Nachman of Breslav. Alevi reports to the Maski newspaper at Sfira in 1881 that during a conversation with local rabbis, he asked them to counter the superstitious practices prevalent among the people. And that one rabbi responded by quoting Rabbi Nachman of Breslav as follows, and I quote, "It is certainly preferable to believe even in stupidities and lies in order to believe also in the truth than to deny everything, meaning to deny stupidities and lies, as thereby it will come to mock everything and hence to deny even what is true." End of quote. So the opinion of this unnamed rabbi that some beliefs are indeed stupidities, yet we must not adopt an overly rationalistic approach to religion that would end up alienating the local population from belief of any sort and thus prove highly counterproductive, is very aligned with Knafo's approach. I think that we can reasonably conjecture that this rabbi is none other than Knafo, more than likely considering that Knafo and Alevi knew each other well, and that Knafo was the only local rabbi quoting Hasidic literature in his books. Another anchor and source of inspiration for Knafo's work was Ottoman Musar literature from the 18th and 19th centuries. The book Shevet Musar, written by Eliyahu Cohen of Izmir and published in 1712, is quoted in every one of Knafo's printed books, but it was the book Pele Yoetz, written by Eliezer Papu and printed in 1824, that appears to deeply impact Knafo's work. In the introduction to his book Shomer Shabbat, Knafo quotes Papu at length, criticizing on the publication of scholarly books accessible to only a handful of rabbis, and encouraging the publication of books for the masses and in the common language. So Knafo's thought rests on the premise that the Jewish community constitutes a single organism, redemption thus not being attainable unless the whole spiritual body is in harmony, and equal access to worship, class equality, and mutual religious responsibility are therefore essential. This idea of spiritual interdependency is deeply rooted in Ottoman Musar literature, and Knafo explicitly refers to it. But if what is borrowed from the Musar literature is significant, what is unsaid or overlooked is of equal significance. For example, in contrast to both Pele Yoetz and Shevet Musar, Knafo neither accepts the traditional rich-poor hierarchy, nor believes this socio-economic order to be unavoidable. And comparing between rich and scholars, Knafo argues that social and spiritual privilege are the fruit of contingency rather than labor. Both the scholars and the rich alike are thus equally obligated to actively share what they have with the masses, to educate the ignorant and seek out those too ashamed to ask for help. In the same vein, Knafo regards tzedakah as solidarity rather than charity, meaning a horizontal act encouraging unity. And ultimately, he maintains that tzedakah is an absolute obligation rather than a good deed, arguing that disregard for the poor and class segregation are similar to murder. And this radical statement reflects the conditions of the society in which he lived as much as a local struggle against the geographic and social fracture between the rich Jews in the Kasbah and the poor in the Mlach of Essaouira. So Hasidic tales and Ottoman Musa literature served Knafo as an important resource for countering his colleagues' sharp criticism. And even retroactively, he found them an important anchor, reinforcing his legitimacy within the community and providing him with additional tools to achieve his goals. But rather than embracing this literature wholesale, Knafo selected specific tales and quoted extracts in order to strengthen his social criticism of the leadership of his day and promote a more egalitarian society. For the last part of this talk, I want to discuss now the importance of book printing for Knafo and his use of Judeo-Arabic. As I mentioned above, printing books was very expensive and complicated at this time, but it was so important for Knafo that he considered it as a religious commandment in order to disseminate Torah knowledge. And Knafo explicitly stated that printed books are more important and precious than an actual Torah scroll, since many more people can use and read them. And just as Knafo contrasted between the elitist scholar in his ivory tower and the popular rabbi writing for the multitude, we see that same duality now transferred to the Torah scroll versus the printed book, with the greater importance attributed to the later. And if the main goal of printing books is to disseminate Torah knowledge, we understand better Knafo's pioneering and systematic use of Judeo-Arabic. In his early and unpublished writings addressing a scholarly audience, Knafo used only rabbinical Hebrew. And in contrast, the books addressed to a popular audience include many passages in Judeo-Arabic. This choice enabled him to convey important information in such a way that it will make sense to his readers. Sometimes he translates and summaries halachot, Jewish laws, in Judeo-Arabic. As well, he employs Judeo-Arabic to sum up his homilies and outline the message of the quoted text. But in Chesed Hashem, Knafo takes a step further and translating and culturally adapting Talmudic Musar and Hasidic tales, sometimes deviating significantly from the source. And he justifies these deliberate divergences on the basis of the booklet's purpose to awaken the piety of the local Jews, rather than educate them about historical Hasidic figures or summarize the moral of the story. In the same vein, Knafo also reiterates the importance of printing in common language, highlighting the possibility of breaking down social barriers through mass dissemination in order to impact on, and I quote, on simple and great persons and on men and women, as he wrote in his introduction to the same book, to Chesed Hashem. The education of women was far from being a central issue among Knafo's contemporaries, but Knafo mentioned them as potential public for his Hasidic text translation. Indeed, publishing Judeo-Arabic books was also a way to overcome the dual challenges of exclusion of women from public spaces and the high incidence of illiteracy among this population. If women barred from attending synagogue and unable to read on their own had very little access to religious works, now at least a relative could read them the Judeo-Arabic texts directly from Knafo's books and thus expose them to Jewish knowledge. So to conclude, in this lecture, I suggest that Rabbi Yosef Knafo's work should be read in the light of a Jewish community turbulent social context. Through his books, Knafo joined the rank of the advocates of modernity, dedicating himself to forging a more egalitarian Jewish society and providing spiritual backing to the social reform movement reflected in his network of benefactors. And rather than representing a break with the religious tradition on the one hand or a form of westernization on the other one, I propose that Knafo's vision was a reframing and a rearticulation of Jewish tradition in order to mobilize it towards social change. So fighting for equal access to religious education and worship, he had no qualms about criticizing the establishment. He also used the printing press to subvert the local authority with his pioneering diffusion of Judeo-Arabic literature in Morocco, further enabling him to reach new audiences. So what about Knafo's impact on the Jewish community of his time? Unfortunately, the main sources on the period found in the European archives and in the modern Jewish press of this time hail from a European point of view. And these sources discuss almost exclusively the role of the local elites and the westernized Jews, while even a prolific native author such as Knafo is not mentioned. Foucault, as I mentioned above, used the concept of subjugated knowledge to describe historical contents that have been buried and masked. And in many ways, the analysis of Knafo's work reveals many sources of subjugated knowledge according to both of Foucault's definitions. Knafo's intellectual production was considered by his rabbinical colleagues inadequate, while for the European Jewish elite living in Essaouira, it was no less than invisible. Moreover, as a traditional and un-westernized native-born Jewish leader, his pointed criticism of the Jewish establishment, as well as his role in the social reform movement, remained underestimated. But there is no doubt that Knafo's voice reached the people to a far greater degree than did the voice of those masculine corresponding with far off Europe, or of the wealthy merchants who lived outside the Melach, as we can learn from the popular support for his work. And I want to conclude with some very last words about Knafo's legacy. A few years after Knafo's passing, his son, Rabbi David, was established as the new chief rabbi of the city. It was in the early beginning of the French protectorate. And he worked for improved Jewish and general education for the youngest generation. He was appreciated by the lay people. He was also in close relationship with many masculine. He taught at the Alliance Israelite school and was considered a modern Jew by the Alliance directorship. In other words, he functioned as the junction point for all those who opt for a new and more modern leadership. So we can say, I think, that his father's efforts on the network he created were not in vain. And thank you. I finish.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. This was a very, very, very interesting lecture, and I have a lot of thoughts. But I would like to invite people to either ask questions, like open your mics and ask your questions, or if you don't want to appear on camera, you can write your questions on the chat, and we will be happy to read them for you. So while this happens, I don't know if this is a question or a general comment. I was very interested in the question of the Askamot, and I was I was thinking that there is a very, like, in any struggle for democratization of that which is kept separate and from the masses, there is a struggle for legitimacy, and there is a difference between legitimacy and endorsement. So power often needs endorsement, whereas attempts to change the system need support, not necessarily endorsement, but support and legitimacy. And I was wondering to what extent this this idea is expressed in the work in the work of Rabbi Knafo, the idea that the attempt to democratize knowledge comes from the realization of what Rabbi Josefa would call the horizontal society, Judaism as a horizontal society, in which everybody has potentially epistemic legitimacy, insofar as they are also part of this covenant. Yeah. And so the terms of the covenant are decided by people. And this is I think this is part of the realization of this horizontal society, the idea that it's people who interpret and apply the terms of this covenant. And so I was wondering if, well, what your thoughts are about this, and if there is something that that Rabbi Knafo says explicitly about this question of how there is a human, too human dimension of the terms of the covenant.
Yeah, thank you for the comment on the question. Actually, the term of covenant is very present in Knafo's books, even in some of the title of his books, and I think that this is a reflection of his own thought. But concerning the lack of Askamot on the question of legitimacy, I think that it is very important to remember that Knafo was a subaltern Jew. He was poor.
He was what?
He had no a subaltern Jew.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. He was poor. He had no official position. He had no European protection, contrary to many Jews in Essaouira, from the elites, the merchants, etc. So he was excluded from the hierarchy of power, and his legitimacy was from the people and for the people. This is maybe the main thing in his work, so in the same vein, we have to remember that he cannot criticize anything too explicitly. And I think that if you want to understand his goals and his social position, we have to remember we have to remember that, and we have to think about theories as, for example, James Scott theories concerning infra-politics and hidden transcript. I really like this concept. For example, Scott says that subordinate groups employ strategies of resistance that go unnoticed by ruling groups, and those strategies are infra-politics. And so during this talk, I try to uncover the hidden transcript of Knafo, and to show its goals between the lines. And I think that to do that, we have to remember the whole picture, the content of the books, the use of printing press, the use of Judeo-Arabic, the lack of Askamot, the legitimacy from the people, the link with Ben Amosel, etc. And only in this way, we can understand that his involvement was not maybe too open, but was much more sophisticated because of his social position as a poor Jew with nothing else than himself.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there anybody who would like to make a comment or ask a question? I see that there's people trying to open their mics. Are there people trying to open their mics? No? Yuval, is there anything you would like to say?
Yeah, I have many questions. Thank you very much, Gabriel. It's really, really interesting. And I'm that of course if we connect it to the series of the lecture series and to the larger project of what you really, I think, really brilliantly termed the subjugated knowledge. And if we're thinking about today, what in our knowledge today, why people like Rabbi Yosef Knafo is not in, we don't know enough about it. There's no research about him and other scholars or intellectuals of his time, mostly in the Arab or Sephardi community. And I'm really wondering, and I'm thinking if it's, first of all, the fact, as you really presented beautifully, the fact that it doesn't really go by the binaries that we already been very institutionalized in our knowledge production between rabbinical work and intellectual work. For instance, is there intellectual or is there rabbinical figure? And as you show, is doing both of them. Second is the languages that is participating in. So Judeo-Arabic, Hebrew, European knowledge. Is it connected to a local sphere or to a global? And that we saw with the Ben Amozeg as well, Livorno and Europe and Morocco and the Hebrew. So this kind of the press, it's expanding the geography. So geographies are different. So in many ways today we are more used to do a scholarship work that is maybe focused on rabbinical figures differently from intellectuals. And of course, people that are more localized about the Morocco, so the Moroccan sphere, but detached from the global aspect of it, and you showed it beautifully. So if you can say something about it in the case of Knafo, but maybe in a larger scale for other figures that you are working on or worked on.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. I have to say that I found no proof of a global connection between Knafo and other authors writing in Judeo-Arabic. Even in the network of benefactors, it is very interesting that there is only one that I found that was not a local Jew. I think that it is very important to understand the local sync in Knafo work. But in other hand, I think that I agree with you that you have to think about the whole modern Judeo-Arabic literature in North Africa during this period. Maybe this is the main thing in the Knafo work and in the novelty that he brings. Because modern Judeo-Arabic literature in North Africa starts a few decades before Knafo, especially in Algeria and in Tunisia. But in Morocco, Knafo is one of the first of his generation to use it. I think that he is the first. I don't want to say it like that. Maybe there is another one that I miss, but I think that he is the first. And I think that it is very important to understand that Judeo-Arabic literature is not only about form, but about content. Because there are at least two reasons to use Judeo-Arabic. The first is to be understandable for the masses, obviously. And the second is to create a modern Judeo-Arabic reading public. And in this sense, I think that Knafo is a part of a broader network of modern writers in Judeo-Arabic, not only rabbis. And even him, it is very difficult to situate him. He's not exactly an intellectual. He's not exactly a typical, North African rabbi. He's not exactly a maskil, but he have, he a little bit of everything. And maybe a last thing concerning the modern Judeo-Arabic literature. Actually, Yosef Tobi and more recently Noam Siena wrote about it, and the claim is that this literature is a mirror of the cultural and social changes of the Jewish society in modern North Africa. And so I totally agree with them. And in some ways, I think that the use of Judeo-Arabic rather than French or even modern Hebrew is a try to modernize the local culture rather than to adopt a new one from the outside, rather than to adopt a new French modernization or Zionist modernization, etc. So, so I think that this is very important to understand Knafo in a broader context.
Thank you. I think that if I can follow up, I think that the question of the language, the Judeo-Arabic, of course, there is few centers, as you mentioned, in Algeria, in Tunisia, and of course, the Iraqi diaspora in Calcutta, in Iraq, and in Ben Amozeg, of course, in Livorno. So there's several centers that are doing Jewish modernization through Judeo-Arabic. So there is a press, there's translation even of modern novels from European languages, from Hebrew, from, of course, popular legends from Arabic that reprinted. It's not only halachic or Judaic literature. And I think maybe part of the fact that we have really little scholarship about it is connected that we are used to, as you said, because we are used to look or research or tell the story of the Jewish, Sephardi Jewish modernization from the European or Europe-centric point of view. So it's only through either through the connection to French or to English, to European language, or through Hebrew and Skala. And I think that this kind of stories of people that were very organized in different kind of a project of Jewish modernization through Judeo-Arabic, but most of them were multilingual. So that's the even more interesting story. So most of them can vote in Hebrew in the same time, and were active in the Hebrew press and Skala and Skillik, and they probably knew the European language and were either writing in it or reading in it. And of course, in the same time doing this project of Judeo-Arabic. So I think part of this mess is to understand the Sephardi modernity through this kind of multilingual, geographical, and of course the local and global perspective. And I think part of it is it's an invitation to open again and rethink the structure of how we conceptualize Jewish modernization as well.
Yes, I agree with that, but I think it is not only about Europocentrism. For sure, this is a part of that. That people prefer to focus on the French sources, on the archives from the Alliance, and the other sources like that. But concerning rabbinic literature, I think, it's not exactly rabbinic literature, but Jewish traditional literature. I think that there is also, a very we are used to focus only on the elite rabbinic literature, for example, on the poskim, on the Sheilot Utshuvot, the legal scholars, sometimes on Kabbalah, and I think that our bias is that all these minor figures, is little rabbis, the educators, etc., who wrote in the common language are not so interesting. They were on, they didn't bring anything new. It was only so. This is a part of I think of writing history from the point of view from an elitist point of view, and not from the below. And I'm pretty sure that I know that there are a lot of Judeo-Arabic literature, but not only Judeo-Arabic literature, a lot of very simple rabbinic literature, etc., that we need to understand if we want to re-examine this period and the process of modernization within the Sephardic world.
Well, thank you very much. And we've already been, I think we're close to the end. We've been already here for an hour. And if nobody else wants to make a comment, is there anybody who would like to make a comment or?
I wouldn't mind making one comment,
yes,
a question perhaps. I found it very interesting. This is all very interesting, especially when we talk about with the discourse about poverty in Morocco around the turn of the century. my only interaction with this discourse has been through the Jewish press, you know, in the north and the coast of the country, where they're very concerned about Moroccan Jews coming from the south of the country, from the interior of the country, and sort of ruining, they say, you know, kind of ruining Casablanca. Mostly Casablanca, and it's a wonderful it's a wonderful other side of that. Honestly, a very disappointing literature, a very disappointing text to read at the precise same moment. I wonder if Knafo ever talks about this kind of internal migration that's happening. It looms very large in the country at this time. I wonder if he says anything about this kind of thing. I realize it's very kind of a long shot.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question. The subject, the poverty is a central subject in Knafo writings, and this is I think the main context, the main historical context. But concerning immigration, actually the waves of internal Jewish immigration in Essaouira began in the beginning of the 19th century, because Essaouira in this time was a big seaport, one of the the economic city of Morocco. So I think at this time I'm not sure that the internal immigration was not too big, but because of these waves of immigration before, the economic situation in the town was a catastrophe, and especially because with the decline of the city. So a lot of people actually in the beginning of the 19th century, the half of the city was composed by Jews. So this is it was urged, and the majority of them were very poor Jews with nothing in the Mlach. And a little minority, but important minority, was composed of wealthy merchants and of some Jewish protégés with French or English or other European protections. So obviously the tensions between the both were very strong, and I think that this tension, we have a reflection of this tension in Knafo writings, but actually he wrote like a traditional rabbi, in the sense that he did not mention explicitly the present situation, but he wrote in general from a non-historical point of view. But this is there.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Gabriel, for this amazing lecture that has added yet another layer to this conversation. And yeah, it was really interesting. Thank you, and thank you all for being here with us today, and for your loyalty. And we hope to see you all in the next month, in the last lecture of the series, which Yuval Ivry and I will lead this time. And we hope to see you all next month. You will receive an email with all the information as usual. And yeah, thank you all, and thank you again, Gabriel.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Angie.
Thank you all.
Everyone. See you next time, June 17th.
June 17th, exactly. Bye. Thank you.
Be safe.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel.